Hey folks, I hope you're all staying healthy and enjoying a little bit of this time off. I know you're probably stuck at home and that stinks, but hopefully you're making some good use of this time. So this video is going to be about reading Shakespeare and about the things to look out for in the text as we're going along. Because there are a few things that you might not know that you need to pay attention to that will really be helpful to your understanding of the text. So we're starting to read Measure for Measure coming up soon, so I want to make sure that we have all the tools that we need in order to go. Um, so what you'll see in this video is a PowerPoint presentation that discusses the types of things to look out for. You're not going to see my face anywhere in the PowerPoint, but you'll have my voiceover to kind of go through the information. So here it goes. Hey folks, so okay, here is the tips and tricks about reading and analyzing Shakespeare that you'll find helpful as we go through. So, some practical guidance. Make sure to give yourself enough time to read and reread complicated parts. We all know that Shakespeare is complicated, and some of you interpret that as Shakespeare is scary, but don't. This is a really interesting play. I think you'll enjoy the content of it. Um, it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit edgy, and I think it's definitely a fun read. Okay, so just make sure that you give yourself enough time to read. It takes me about 8 hours to read the play all the way through myself. So we're breaking these up into different acts. Just make sure that for each act you give yourself enough time to really kind of parse through the information. And make sure that when you do it, you're in a quiet space that doesn't have a lot of distractions. Okay, that's a big deal because you want to make sure that you can focus. And then also the biggest thing is take notes and make sure that you are thinking about those notes as you're interacting with these ideas. Um, make sure that you're kind of making those connections so that way you can interpret them and use those notes for interpretation for the next couple of weeks. So remember that Shakespeare's complicated, and that's not even just to us. His audience probably didn't really have much of an idea of what was going on either. He made up more than 400 words that are now part of the English language that hadn't been before. So his audience was probably pretty confused. But those 400 words are the only ones that really caught on. There are plenty of other words that Shakespeare used that didn't. So keep in mind that he combined words together um, to kind of make new ideas and new words. And any time that there's a combination of words, you want to think about each of those words and how they work together. If you want to take a look at the British Library website, I left the citation for David Crystal's Tempestuous Words, The Tempest, and Shakespeare's Linguistic Innovation. Obviously, that's about the Tempest, not Measure for Measure, but it does talk about how Shakespeare used language and how that is, um, how that's used in Shakespeare's work. So when I say take notes, I recommend downloading the document as a PDF rather than just viewing it online. This lets you highlight important parts, it lets you rephrase complicated parts so that they're easier for you to remember. As you can see, I've left some of my notes up on the video here um, to kind of show what 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 you might need to do to break things down into simplest terms. So make sure that I know it says bring them to class with you. I know we're doing a large part of this online, if not all of it. So just make sure that you have access to them. So, email them to yourself or, keep your laptop near you, something like that. You can print them out, but it's going to be long. I want to say I printed out a copy just to make it easier for portability so I didn't have to drag my laptop around, and it was 125 pages, something like that. So you can print it if you're more of like a notes by hand type of person, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because that's a little bit costly. You can also purchase the book, put some links in Blackboard so that way you can see where to get them. They're in the term materials course readings, and it kind of talks about where you can find that particular book if you like a book to hold and to read. So there are some things to remember. Remember the characters that we are seeing as we go. If you see somebody new in the text and you have no idea who they are, look back at the dramatis personae at the beginning of the play. The dramatis personae will tell you, who's who, how they interact with one another, that sort of thing. Like it'll tell you that Isabella in Measure for Measure is Claudio's sister. right? And also that she's a nun, right? So it tells you information that's pertinent to what you're reading, and in case you forget, it gives you a refresher. Also, make sure that you read the stage directions. They probably don't seem important to you, but they show where an action is taking place, who's coming into a scene, and what their condition is. If they're hiding, if they're right out in the open, if everybody can hear them, if only some people can hear them. So you want to make sure that you read these things. Now, what is a dramatis personae? Well, essentially, that's just characters in the play. It shows relationships, like I just said. So we can see Duke of Vienna, later called Friar Lodovic, because he disguises himself as a friar. Some ethical issues there. We'll talk about those at another time. But you can see how the other information is presented as well. And if you were to try to read a play without knowing anything about the characters, then you're going to be stuck losing that background information, because we don't have the same type of um, interactivity that we would with some sort of video. We have just what's on the text, right? We wouldn't be able to get any context clues from what they're wearing or how they hold themselves or their body language, right? So we just have what Shakespeare wrote down to work with. So make sure that you know who's who and what they're doing in the play. Now, stage directions. Yes, there actually was one: exit pursued by bear. That was probably the coolest stage direction I've ever seen. But this helps you identify who's coming into a scene, who's leaving it, who's sneaking, who's hiding it, who's getting chased by a bear. It gives you that information. So also, you want to remember that you can only see what characters are saying, not what they're thinking, unless there's an aside. So an aside happens when a character separates from the other characters on the stage and just sort of speaks to the audience. You can think of it in terms of um, your your character on the stage is now in a spotlight, everybody else is in the dark, and the character is speaking directly to you. And Shakespeare uses this as a way to like give the audience some background information or make a joke at another's expense, or even to deceive another character, right? So these asides are important because a lot of times it gives us more information about what's happening. So the fact that we don't usually see what actors are thinking or what their body language is, that complicates things a little bit. So we just need to work with what we see on the text, like I said before. Anything in italics is going to be some sort of indication of what characters are doing, not what they're saying. So keep an eye out for those italics. Also, look for tons of dirty jokes in Measure for Measure. If you're feeling like you're like, oh, I don't want to read Shakespeare, there are so many dirty jokes and not so hidden dirty jokes. So you can easily see, there's some fun in there. Okay, so just know that if you're the type of person that would enhance your experience, keep an eye out for those. So I want to give some context on the early modern period. King James was in power during this time, and he was kind of a complicated individual. He actually said, "Kings are justly called gods, for they exercise a manner or resemblance of divine power upon earth." So you can imagine that he's a guy who is pretty into himself. He thinks that he has the power of the gods, or maybe he doesn't think that, but he definitely um, says that, right? So you want to make sure that you kind of keep that in mind. And now everything that was written during this time period was essentially written for the king, right? If you read anything that was written during this time period, typically the first page is going to be some sort of invocation to a duke or to a someone in power, if not the king himself, but someone else who represents the power of the king. So you want to keep that in mind as you go. So remember King James. We're also going to talk about the humors a little bit. There's not so much of the influence of the humors in Measure for Measure, but we're also going to talk about religious imagery as well. Same thing, not a huge amount of imagery. Shakespeare's pretty blunt about religion in terms of Measure for Measure because one of the characters, Isabella, is a nun. So it's pretty much out in the open. But some more background of King James. He's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley. So if you ever saw that show on the CW called Reign, um, it's Mary's son with Lord Darnley. Okay, he actually was the guy who commissioned the King James version of the Bible that many religions still use today. He believed in the divine right of kings, right? That belief that the king or queen was the embodiment of God on earth. This makes it a little bit easier to control people, don't you think? And this deference that he expects extends to dukes, like the Duke and Angelo, who's his second in command, who takes control over Vienna for most of the play. Um, and they're appointed by the king or the queen, in this case, the fictional king, and they're granted legitimacy in that way. Um, and also, he used the divine right of kings to suppress both Puritans and Catholics using that idea of divine right. Okay, so there was a lot of religious conflict at the time that I'll go into in just a little bit, but he was using that to control what was happening during his reign. So the humors. Keep an eye out for the language in the chart. Anything about, typically for this particular play, it's going to be blood. It's going to be, um, yeah, it's gonna mostly be blood, is what they kind of talk about. And so that's talking about this sanguine type of character. The organ that's associated with this humor is the liver. Um, so you can see that, how that's used, and that it identifies amorous, happy, generous, carefree, optimistic, right? Each of these things. So just anytime you see something about yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, or blood, as we're going through either this text, or as you on your own are going through other Shakespeare texts, if you decide to, that these hold different connotations. So definitely kind of look them up to make sure you understand exactly what's happening. Okay, so like I alluded to before, the use of religion in text is kind of all over the place in Shakespeare's works. So there's a fight between the Protestant and the Catholics at this time. They've been fighting for about 100 years. Protestants gained some power, and then the Catholics took it back, and then the Protestants took it back, and it was just kind of going back and forth. But then finally King James comes in, who was Catholic, and he just kind of tells everyone, nah, I'm the dude, right? And so everybody just he just decides that everyone's just going to listen to him. It's not going to be about religion. It's just about him and the right that he has to rule based on that divine right of kings that we talked about earlier. There is a little bit of a typo in the next bullet point. In Measure for Measure, Shakespeare uses Angelo, not Antonio. I apologize for that. And the Duke to showcase the religious conflict happening during his lifetime, right? So Angelo is going to be the puritanical one who wants control over everybody else, who wants to have these really strict measures. And then we have the Duke, who is more relaxed, kind of laid back, the older kind of style of religion. So, just sort of keep that in mind, that conflict is happening in the background. But in the foreground, we see Isabella, who's a nun, right? So you'd think that the use of religion would be solely around her, but it's not necessarily. Okay, so you want to make sure that you've got that kind of in your mind as we continue reading. So writing about Shakespeare is a little bit complicated. So how do we make sense of Shakespeare in our writing? Well, Shakespeare's language in MLA is a little bit, I'm not going to say complicated, but it has its own rules, right? So the title of the play is going to go in italics, no quotation marks, just italics. And to cite plays, we're going to use act, scene, line formatting. Okay, we do still use the space/space method to show the reader line breaks, because ultimately, even though this is a play, it's still poetry within a play. So for example, do not give dalliance, line break, too much the rain, the strongest oaths are straw, line break, to the fire and the blood, right? And there's an instance of using blood in the text. So that should kind of trigger you to think, oh, the humors, right? So you want to make sure that you've got that kind of always going in the back of your mind, just as a little reminder there. But this is how you would want to cite. And then you can see Shakespeare, Act 4, Scene 1, lines 51 through 53. Okay, so make sure that you're using that. Check out the spacing. Notice that there's no commas in there. Just kind of focus on that. So when you quote Shakespeare, make sure that you double check that autocorrect doesn't change stuff on you. There's some weird punctuation in strange spots, apostrophes kind of showing up out of nowhere in The Tempest. You can see that, in that quote that we just used. Prospero advises Ferdinand, do not give dalliance too much the rain, the strongest oaths are straw, to the, right, we know it's the, fire, in, we know it's in, but those letters are just missing. Right, so we want to make sure that not only do we introduce all quotations to make sure that the quote makes sense to the reader, provide some context, but then make sure that quoting it is done properly as far as like the weird punctuation and that sort of thing. Now, the next sentence or the previous sentence, depending on how your argument is structured, should indicate what this quotation is saying. And you can see that example, right there. Prospero advises Ferdinand that he should not take his vow to abstain from premarital sex with Miranda lightly. Okay, so, that's essentially what that quotation is saying. That's especially important when we're writing about Shakespeare. So if you decide to write about it for your essay or when you're writing your discussion posts, make sure to explain how you interpreted the language. And then provide analysis for what that quote does in the play, right? So when Prospero extends his advice to Ferdinand, he intends for him to realize that passion often outweighs reason, when in reality it should not, right? That is my particular interpretation of what that phrase suggests. Okay, so you want to make sure you have all three of those things anytime you're writing about Shakespeare. So when quoting, also make sure that the reader knows who's speaking. Don't say that Shakespeare wrote this because, most of the time, actually all the time in Shakespeare, there's multiple players involved. So if you say Shakespeare says this, well, we don't know if it's Isabella who's saying it in the play. We don't know if it's Angelo. We don't know if it's the Duke. We don't know if it's the Duke who's dressed up as Friar Lodovick, right? We don't know these things. So we need to, as a writer, be conscious of the fact that the reader needs to understand who's saying what. And if you discuss more general things, stuff about the early modern period, stuff about the play more generally, you can say that Shakespeare indicates it, right? For example, Shakespeare uses Vienna as a microcosm of England, with factions resisting each other to achieve dominance, right? Because that's about the play as a whole rather than a particular quotation or particular individual that's happening. All right, folks, so those are the big things that I want you to pay attention to in terms of what's happening in Measure for Measure and how you want to read it. So keep those things in mind as you go. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know. Like I said before, the PowerPoint will be posted in Blackboard. You'll also have access to the video there. So use these tools to help you kind of understand what's happening. All right, so I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Stay healthy, be safe, do all of those things. All right, and as I said before, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out.